I remember the sound first, not the silence after the surrender, but the low, uneasy hum of the world trying to start again. We were stationed outside Yokohama, in a half-destroyed warehouse that smelled of rust, smoke, and salt from the nearby sea. The rain had stopped that morning, leaving puddles that reflected the grey sky like broken mirrors. I was sitting on a crate, my rifle propped against the wall, the same way I had done in France, Belgium, Germany, and now here, across the world from home. The war was over, they said, but it didn't feel over. The noise in my head never stopped. Every creak of the metal roof, every distant shout or truck backfiring made my muscles tense. The radio in my hands, the same one I'd carried since Normandy, was the only thing that still gave me some kind of peace. It had been my link to the world beyond the battlefield, my last piece of order, when everything around me was falling apart. I'd patched it up a dozen times with scraps, gum, and luck, but it still worked. At least it used to. That morning, when I turned the dial, all I got was static, just an endless, ghostly hiss. A local interpreter came by our post that day, bringing with him a few Japanese civilians who were looking for work, or food, or both. Among them was a man who stood apart from the rest, older than the others, his clothes cleaner, his posture straight, even though he looked exhausted. He kept staring at the radio in my lap, eyes narrowing like he recognized something sacred. The interpreter said he used to be an engineer before, worked in communications or manufacturing, something like that. When he asked if he could take a look at it, I hesitated. I didn't trust easily that the war had stripped me of that instinct, but there was something about the way he handled himself, a quiet respect that made me nod. He approached slowly, almost like I might change my mind. His fingers, thin and stained with oil, traced the edges of the radio before he carefully opened the back. He didn't speak for a long time. I watched his eyes move across the wires, tubes, and circuits, as though he was reading a book written in a language he once knew but had forgotten. Around us, the world was still fragile. The Japanese soldiers we once fought were now just men in ragged uniform trying to feed their families. The kids played in the mud near the pier, and American trucks rolled by with supplies, their engines coughing through the wet air. Everything smelled like burnt wood and salt water. The engineer finally said something, his voice quiet and heavy with an accent but clear enough for me to understand. This, we could not build. He looked at me, then back at the radio, and repeated it slower, almost as if he didn't believe the words himself. We could not build like this. I didn't know what to say. I thought he was being humble or polite, maybe even fearful, but there was no flattery in his tone, only truth. He explained through the interpreter that during the war, Japan couldn't afford the materials, the precision, or the time to build something so small, so durable, so consistent. He said their equipment was crude, rushed, often unreliable. They built for necessity, not endurance. Then he looked at the logo stamped on the metal casing, made in the USA, and his face changed. There was admiration, yes, but also sorrow. It struck me then how strange it was to see a man who had likely worked on the other side of the same war, now holding something that had helped us defeat him. I watched him close the radio gently, his hands trembling slightly as he reattached the screws. He looked up at me and said, "War destroys the hands that build." Those words hit me harder than I expected, because I realized that while we'd fought to destroy his world, he'd probably spent those same years trying to preserve what little of it he could. And maybe that's what made the difference. We fought with weapons, but they fought with everything else they had. Desperation, loyalty, survival. I wanted to hate him, but I couldn't. In that moment, I saw a reflection of myself in him, a man tired of loss, tired of orders, tired of pretending that victory meant anything more than being the one still breathing at the... He didn't stay long. After returning the radio, he bowed slightly, then walked away toward the docks where the sun was trying to push through the clouds. I remember sitting there for a long while, staring at that little machine in my... The static was still there, whispering like ghosts through the speaker. I turned the dial again and again until finally a faint signal came through, a woman's voice singing something soft and distant, maybe American, maybe not. I couldn't tell. It didn't matter. For the first time since the war began, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace, not joy, something quieter, understanding me. The war had taken everything that made us human and replaced it with fear. But that day, in the ruins of Yokohama, I saw a glimpse of what it might mean to be whole again, not through victory, not through power, but through recognition, the shared pain between two men who had both lost too much to ever be the same. Tell me where you're watching this. I want to know where stories like mine still reach hearts that remember what it cost us to get here. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain came back, soft at first, then harder, tapping against the tin roof like the ticking of a clock that had survived the war better than any of us. The others in the unit were asleep, or pretending to be. I sat alone with that radio on my knees, staring at it as though it could answer the questions I hadn't been brave enough to ask. I kept hearing the Japanese engineer's voice in my head. We could not build like this, and it echoed in a way that wasn't about machines anymore. Maybe he meant more than he said. Maybe it wasn't the soldering or the steel he was talking about. Maybe it was about spirit, the kind that keeps men from falling apart when everything else does. We'd built things during the war too. Weapons, planes, bombs, and radios like this one. But somewhere inside all that creation there was destruction too, waiting patiently. And I wondered, sitting there in the dim glow of a single lamp, whether we'd really built anything that could outlast the silence that came after the killing stopped. I had carried that radio across 3 continents. I remember its hum in the foxholes of Normandy, when the air smelled of rain and blood and cordite, and we waited for orders that would decide who lived and who didn't. I remembered its faint crackle in the freezing nights of the Ardennes, when the snow turned pink and our breath looked like ghosts escaping our lungs. I'd wrapped it in a torn blanket once, just to keep it from freezing solid. That thing was more faithful than sleep, more constant than the sun. It never judged, never spoke back, only listened. And now, holding it in a land that had once been our enemy's heart, I felt as though I was holding every piece of the war that had survived with me. When I closed my eyes, I saw faces, men who never made it out, men whose voices had come through the airwaves one last time before fading into static forever. That's what war does. It turns life into fragments, like broken transmissions, each one cutting out just when you think you're about to understand. The next morning, I found the engineer again. He was standing near the harbour, helping some American soldiers repair a generator. His posture was calm, but I could see the weariness in his movement, the way he hesitated before touching anything electrical, as if haunted by what he'd seen those machines do. When he noticed me, he smiled politely, not sure if I'd forgotten him already. I asked the interpreter to tell him that his words had stayed with me. He nodded, and after a long pause, said something that the interpreter struggled to translate. The closest he could get was, "War makes us clever in the wrong ways." I didn't need the perfect translation to understand. We both stood there watching the cranes swing cargo over the docks, American supplies, Japanese labor, 2 nations rebuilding, side by side, pretending the blood between them had dried completely. The engineer said he used to design radios for the civilian market before the war. He'd been proud of them, small, elegant, simple. He said his company had been forced to convert to military production when the conflict began. He never touched another radio for home use after that. When I asked him why, he said quietly, "Because when you hear enough voices of the dead, music feels dishonest." That hit me harder than I expected. I thought about the broadcasts I'd listened to on that radio, the speeches, the commands, the music we used to drown out the fear. Maybe he was right. Maybe every song that had played through those speakers carried ghosts we never wanted to face. I told him, through the interpreter, that I didn't think music was dishonest. I thought it was memory, the good kind, the kind that reminds you of what you're still fighting for. He didn't answer. He just looked out at the horizon, where the clouds were breaking apart, and a sliver of sunlight was touching the waves. He said something then that the interpreter didn't translate, maybe because he didn't want to, or maybe because he couldn't find the word. I asked what he said, and the interpreter finally muttered. He says, "Maybe we both lost the same thing." That stayed with me for years. It took me a long time to understand what he meant. It wasn't about losing the war or winning it. It was about losing the part of ourselves that could build without thinking of destruction, the part that built for hope instead of fear, the part that believed in connection, in the invisible thread between 2 voices across the air. He and I had both worked with radio, though in very different ways. He built them, I used them, but we both lived through what they became, instruments that carried more death than song. Maybe that's why, when he looked inside mine, he wasn't just seeing wires and tubes. He was seeing the proof that once, before everything fell apart, human hands could still make something that endured, something that worked even after the worst of us had failed. Before I left Japan, I gave him that radio. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. It felt like giving away a piece of my soul, but I figured it belonged to him more than it ever did to me. He didn't refuse it. He just held it close, eyes wide with surprise, and bowed so deeply I thought he might break. I never saw him again after. Maybe he fixed it, maybe he didn't. But I like to think that somewhere, in the years that followed, that old radio played again, not for soldiers, not for war, but for peace. Maybe he heard a broadcast from America one night and realized that despite everything, the air was still full of voices trying to reach one another. If you've made it this far into my story, I want you to pause for a second. Think about what you've built in your own life and what it cost you to build it. If these memories mean something to you, subscribe so you can walk with me through the rest of this road back from the war. The first time that radio came alive under fire was in Normandy. I remember the fields smelling like burnt wheat and diesel, the sky thick with smoke, the kind that turns the sun into a pale, trembling disk. We'd landed hours earlier, soaked, terrified, half deaf from the shelling. I dug myself into the wet earth and hugged that radio like it was a living thing. The operator before me, a kid from Ohio named Mitchell, had taken a round to the chest before he could even call out our position. His blood was still warm on the handset when I picked it up. I didn't even know what I was doing at first. Training doesn't prepare you for the sound of men dying around you while you're trying to find the right frequency. All I remember is my hand shaking as I turned the dials, my breath fogging the glass. Then, through all the static and chaos, came a voice, steady, calm, distant. "Baker Company, do you copy?" I could have cried. That voice was civilization. It was home. It was everything that wasn't this hell. "Copy," I said, barely able to speak. "We're pinned down. Grid 47. Repeat, Grid 47. I don't know how I kept talking. I just did. The shells were still falling. The ground shook like the earth itself was trying to spit us out. But that voice stayed with me. "Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound." Those words became a heartbeat. The battle lasted 3 days. 3 days of crawling through mud, dodging shrapnel, watching men vanish mid-sentence. The radio never stopped humming. Even when the power pack died, I found a way to keep it running. I scavenged batteries from the wounded, pulled wires from wrecked jeeps, anything to keep the signal alive. Because when that hum went silent, the world stopped making sense. Every burst of static meant someone was still out there, someone who could hear us. I think that's when I started to believe the radio was more than a tool. It was a lifeline, a voice from the part of the world that still had order, light, direction. When the mortars hit the ridge on the second night, the explosion threw me back so hard, I thought my spine had snapped. I woke up half buried in mud, ears ringing, and the first thing I did was reach for the radio. I didn't even check if I was bleeding. My hands found it, dented but intact, the antenna bent, the knobs stiff. I wiped it off, breathed on it, and turned it on. Static, then a crackle, then a voice again, faint, distant, but alive. "Hang in there, boys. Hang in there." I think that's when I stopped believing in God and started believing in signals. When we finally took that field, there was barely anything left of our company. Mitchell was gone. So was Rodriguez, my closest friend, the guy who used to draw cartoons in the margins of the maps. He'd been hit trying to drag a wounded man out of the mud. I carried his dog tags for the rest of the war next to the radio. I remember sitting in that crater after it was all over, the world eerily quiet, and tuning the dial again just to hear that same hum. It was the only sound that told me I was still real. That radio followed me through France, through the Ardennes, through Germany. Every battle, every night raid, every cold dawn when the fog swallowed us whole, it was there. I could tell by the way it sounded if the signal was American, British, or German. You learn those things, the rhythm of speech, the panic in the static. There was one night outside Aachen when we picked up a German transmission by accident. The operator on the other side was just a kid. I could hear it in his voice. He was calling for his mother, over and over. The interpreter told me to cut the line. I didn't. I just sat there, listening. He couldn't have been older than 17. When the signal died, I realized I'd been shaking. That's the part they don't tell you. You start out thinking the enemy is something monstrous, something far away and different. But the closer you get, the more they sound like you. Their fear sounds like yours. Their silence sounds like yours. By the end of it, I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Every transmission felt like an echo. I think the radio taught me that long before I understood it. It carried voices from every side, every language, all tangled together in the static of war. Maybe that's why the Japanese engineer's words hit me so hard later. We could not build like this. Maybe no one can, not when the purpose is destruction. Maybe we can only build like that when we still remember how to connect. There was another moment, months after Normandy, when the radio saved us again. In the Ardennes, during the snowstorm that froze men where they stood. The cold cut through everything, even through hope. The batteries died faster in the cold, and the wires stiffened. We were surrounded, the Germans pushing from both sides, and the radio had gone quiet for almost an hour. That hour felt like death itself. I was pounding the side of it with my fist, screaming at it, begging it to work, as if it could hear me. Then, out of nowhere, a crackle, faint at first, then a voice. "Hold tight, Baker Company. We've got you on scope." I don't even remember what happened next. The sound of our artillery firing back, the white smoke, the sudden heat of explosions breaking the silence. It all blurred together. All I know is that I never let go of that radio, not once. When we finally pulled back, I carried it against my chest like a wounded friend. Years later, when I handed it to that Japanese engineer, I realized it wasn't just metal and wires I was giving him. It was everything. The ghosts, the fear, the hope, the sound of men who refused to die quietly. I think he understood that. When he said they couldn't build something like it, maybe he wasn't talking about technology. Maybe he meant the spirit inside it, the faith that something built by human hands could still hold a human voice through all that chaos. I like to think that somewhere, that radio still remembers those voices, still hums with that same heartbeat. Maybe if you listen closely enough, the static still carries a trace of them. All the lost, all the waiting, all the broken, trying to reach across the noise. By the time we reached Germany, the radio had become my second heart. I slept with it, carried it under my coat, talked to it when no one else was awake. The world was falling apart around us, entire towns burning down to their foundations, the smell of iron and smoke thick enough to taste. You could feel the end coming, not in victory, but in exhaustion. Every mile forward felt like walking deeper into something that would never let you go. We were ghosts in uniforms by then, living on coffee, cigarettes, and the sound of orders we didn't believe in anymore. Somewhere between Aachen and Cologne, we were cut off. The snow had turned to freezing rain, and our trucks were stuck axle-deep in mud. The road had disappeared under shell fire. I remember the lieutenant screaming into the wind, trying to get through on his own radio, but the signal was dead. Mine wasn't. Somehow, through all that chaos, I found a frequency still alive. It wasn't clear, just a voice lost in static, fading in and out like someone shouting from the bottom of a river. "Hold position. Repeat. Hold position." That was all we needed, a thread to hang on to. We dug in and waited. The shelling started an hour later. You never forget that sound, the whistle, the split second of silence, then the world tearing open. Men threw themselves into the mud, clutching helmets, praying to gods they'd forgotten how to believe in. I lay face down, the radio pressed against my chest, feeling each explosion vibrate through it like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized the signal was still there. I could hear voices, frantic now, calling out coordinates, adjusting fire. I shouted back until my throat burned. "We're here! We're here!" I don't even know if anyone heard me. The radio crackled, sputtered, then went dead again. For a moment, I thought I had gone deaf. Then came another sound, a scream, close. I turned, and the lieutenant was down, his face half covered in blood and dirt. I crawled to him, dragging the radio through the muck. He was still breathing, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Get it working," he said. "Get it working, or we die here." So I did. My hands were numb, bleeding from the cold, but I kept twisting the knobs, adjusting the antenna, ripping open the back panel with my knife. The wires were wet, caked with mud. I tore off a strip of my sleeve and wiped them clean, praying to something, maybe to the radio itself, maybe to the ghosts already circling above us. I don't know how long it took, but then suddenly it crackled back to life. A new voice came through, calm, clipped, professional. "Copy your signal, Baker Company. Air support en route. Hold on." I laughed, though it came out more like a sob. I wanted to believe it, but after so many false hopes, belief felt dangerous. Still, I held on. The shells kept falling, the rain kept freezing, and I clung to that little box of metal and faith as if it were the last living thing on Earth. When the air support finally came, we barely noticed at first. The first bombs fell far off, a distant thud, then closer. Then the sky filled with the roar of engines and the trembling thunder of salvation. It was brutal and beautiful at once. The Germans broke their line, and what was left of us stumbled out of that crater, half blind, half crazed, covered in mud and blood that wasn't all ours. I remember looking down at the radio afterward, its casing cracked, one knob missing, antenna bent beyond repair, but still humming, still alive. I don't know why I kissed it, but I did. Maybe because I knew it had saved more than our lives. It had saved the part of me that still believed in connection, in the possibility that a voice out there might still answer. But war has a way of twisting everything, even miracle. A week later, we came across a German convoy that had been hit by one of our airstrikes. The trucks were charred husks, and the snow around them was black. There were bodies, soldiers, yes, but also civilians, women, maybe children. It was hard to tell. The smell hit first, that sweet, heavy stench that stays in your throat for years. One of the men in my unit started laughing, not out of cruelty, but shock. That hollow laughter that comes when the world stops making sense. I just stood there, holding that same radio had called in the coordinate. I realized in that moment that maybe I'd helped do this. Maybe my signal, my voice, had guided death to this place. I couldn't breathe. I dropped the radio and stepped back, staring at it like it had turned into a weapon. Maybe it always was. That night I couldn't eat, couldn't speak. I sat by the fire, the radio beside me, silent for once. The others joked, smoked, drank what was left of the whiskey we'd found in a barn. But I just watched the flames dance in the reflection of its metal casing. Every burst of orange looked like the flashes I'd seen in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in every corner of hell we'd crawled through. I realized then that I wasn't carrying a piece of equipment, I was carrying a witness. That radio had heard it all. Every scream, every prayer, every lie we told ourselves to stay alive. And it remembered, even when we tried to forget. When we finally reached the outskirts of Cologne, the city was nothing but bones. Towers snapped in half, windows shattered, walls pockmarked with bullets. The cathedral still stood somehow, defiant against the ruin. I climbed the rubble one afternoon and turned on the radio again, not expecting, but what I heard froze me. It was a German broadcast, faint but clear, a woman's voice reading names, names of the dead, names of the missing. She read them like a hymn. I didn't understand every word, but I recognized the rhythm of grief. It sounded the same in every language. I sat there for a long time, just listening, until the sun went down and the static swallowed her voice again. Maybe that's what broke something in me for good. The realization that both sides were talking into the same air, sending their pain into the same invisible space, and that space didn't care who we were. It just carried the sound. That's what war is, really. A sky full of voices that never find their way home. So when the Japanese engineer opened that radio months later and told me his people couldn't build like it, maybe he didn't know the truth. Maybe no one can build something like that again. Because to make a machine like that, you have to live through what we did. You have to pour into it the madness, the hope, the grief that comes from hearing too many men die with your voice in their ears. You have to believe, even when you shouldn't, that someone on the other end will hear you, that someone will answer. Tell me something. If you'd been there, if you'd seen the world burn and then tried to build it again, do you think you could still believe in people? Comment below with one phrase. I still believe. Let me see how many of us are left who do. When I came home, the silence was the hardest part. People think it's the nightmares or the sudden noises, but no, it's the silence. The kind that follows you into every room, every conversation, every night you lie awake and realize the world has moved on without you. I landed in San Francisco in late '45, stepping off the ship into a sea of cheers and flags. But it all sounded like static to me. Familiar? Yes, but meaningless. I had that radio in my pack, the same one that had once carried life and death across oceans, and I remember clutching it tight when the crowd roared. A woman pressed a flower into my hand. A kid waved a paper flag. I smiled, but inside, something didn't connect. The world looked the same, but I wasn't. I'd spent too long speaking in codes, too long waiting for voices that might never come back. How do you explain that to people who never heard the sound of a man dying through a headset? How do you tell them that every time you close your eyes, you can still hear the hum between frequencies, the echo of something that refuses to stop calling your name? I moved back to Ohio, to my parents' farm. The fields were empty then, most of the young men gone or just returning. My father barely spoke. My mother cried when she thought I wasn't looking. They'd aged a decade in the years I'd been gone, and I suppose I had too. I tried to fall back into the rhythm of normal life, mending fences, milking cows, pretending the world hadn't been on fire, but the nights were the worst. The crickets, the wind, the lowing of the cattle, it all blended into a kind of static that made me restless. So one evening, I unpacked the radio, set it on the table, and turned it on. It took a minute to warm up, a familiar hum filling the kitchen, like the heartbeat of something I'd buried long ago. The signal was faint, carrying stations from Chicago, St. Louis, sometimes even the East Coast, when the weather was right. I'd sit there for hours, just listening, not to the words, but to the spaces between them, the static, the silence, the crackle. That was where the truth lived. People said I was quiet after the war. They were right. But the truth is, words didn't fit anymore. They were too small for the things I'd seen, too clean for what I carried. I tried working at the local repair shop for a while. Radios, of course. It was what I knew best. Customers would bring them in, complaining about bad reception, blown tubes, shorted wires. I'd open the back, breathe in the smell of dust and electricity, and for a few minutes, I'd feel like myself again. The world inside a radio made sense. Cause and effect, wire to current, signal to sound. No confusion, no chaos. You fix what's broken, and it works again. But people aren't like that. You can't rewire grief. You can't solder shut the cracks where memory leaks through. Every time I repaired a set, I thought of that Japanese engineer. I wondered what became of him, whether he found work, whether his family survived. Sometimes I like to imagine him sitting somewhere across the ocean, tuning a dial, and hearing my country's broadcasts drift through the night air. Maybe he even heard the same songs I did. Maybe the same voices that once told us to fight were now reading the weather or playing jazz. I like to think of him not as an enemy, not even as a friend, but as another man trying to hear something human again. Maybe that's what connects us all in the end. Not the things we build or destroy, but the way we keep listening, even after the noise fades. One day, a boy came into the shop. He couldn't have been more than 12, curious as a cat, asking how the radios worked. His father had been in the Pacific, he said, but never talked about it. The boy wanted to learn about the machines that won the war. I didn't know how to tell him that no machine ever won anything, but I showed him anyway. I let him open the back of an old Philco and touch the glass tubes, the copper coils. His eyes lit up when the signal came through, some station out of Cleveland playing a swing tune. He smiled like he'd found magic, and in that moment, I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe this was what building again looked like, passing on the knowledge, the care, the awe of creation instead of destruction. Still, there were nights when I'd wake up sweating, hearing the old radio in my dreams, calling out from the mud, from the snow, from every place I'd left a part of myself behind. Sometimes I'd get up, walk barefoot to the kitchen, and turn it on again. I'd tune the dial until the static swallowed everything, and in that noise, I'd almost hear them. Mitchell, Rodriguez, the lieutenant, their voices faint, just beyond the edge of recognition. It's strange how memory works. It's not what you choose to keep that stays with you. It's what refuses to leave. Years passed. The shop grew quiet as televisions replaced radios and younger men took over the town. I kept the old one, my war radio, on a shelf in the corner. I never plugged it in again. Its casing was worn, the knobs dulled from years of use, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It had carried too much, remembered too much. I figured it deserved its rest as much as I did. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees, I could swear I still heard it. That soft hum, the faint crackle of a world trying to reach me from somewhere far beyond. Time has a strange way of softening things without ever really healing them. The faces fade, the edges blur, but the feelings remain, buried deep under layers of routine and silence. I grew old quietly, like a man afraid of disturbing the ghosts that followed him home. The war never left. It just learned to speak in whispers instead of screams. Sometimes I'd be walking down the road at dusk and catch the smell of oil or burnt metal, and for a split second, I'd be back there. The mud under my nails, the sound of the radio crackling in the dark. I don't think anyone truly comes back from something. You just learn to live with the echo. I got married in 1952. Her name was Mary. She had kind eyes, the kind that could see through the noise inside me. I met her at the repair shop. She came in with a broken record player. I remember the way she laughed when I told her I preferred radios, said they were more honest, less perfect. She asked what I meant, and I told her that with a radio, you never get the whole song. There's always static, always something missing, but that's what makes it real. She didn't say anything then, but later she told me that was the moment she fell in love with me. We built a life together, slow and careful, like people who'd both known loss. She taught at the local school. I kept fixing radios until I couldn't anymore. We didn't have much, but we had peace, or something close to it. Still, there were moments she'd catch me staring at nothing, my mind somewhere across the ocean. She'd touch my hand and say, "You're not there anymore." But part of me always was. Once, when our son was little, he found the old war radio in the attic. He dragged it downstairs, covered in dust, asking what it was. I told him it was how we used to talk to the world before the world got too loud. He wanted to turn it on, but I said no. Some things, I told him, should stay quiet. He didn't understand then, and maybe I didn't either. I wasn't protecting him from ghosts. I was protecting myself from the sound of remembering. There were nights when Mary would fall asleep beside me, and I'd sit up listening to the house breathe, the creak of wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint wind pressing against the windows. It all blended into that same familiar static. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and imagine tuning a dial, searching through the noise for something beyond it. Not a voice, not a song, just a sign that all the chaos had meant something. That the men I lost weren't just gone, but transformed into something endless. Something that still moved through the air, whispering through the cracks between frequencies. I like to think they were still out there, invisible but near, waiting to be heard. As the years passed, the world became louder. Radios gave way to television, then to machines I couldn't make sense of. People stopped listening, really listening. Everything became faster, sharper, emptier. But sometimes, when I walked through town, I'd catch the faint sound of a broadcast coming from a diner or a passing car, and I'd smile. That old hum was still there, hiding beneath all the noise, the same heartbeat that had kept me alive decades before. The signal hadn't died, it had just changed form, like all of us. Mary died before me. Cancer, quiet, stubborn, unrelenting. I remember sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, and hearing the soft hiss of the oxygen tank beside her. It sounded like the radio, that same gentle, endless breath between life and silence. After she was gone, I found myself talking to her the way I used to talk into the headset all those years ago. I'd whisper into the air, hoping she could hear me somewhere in the static. Maybe she could. Maybe that's what all of this is. Life, death, memory, just signals passing through the dark, trying to reach someone who still remembers how to listen. When I look back now, I don't see the war as battles and dates anymore. I see faces, sounds, small moments that refuse to disappear. I see the Japanese engineer's hands trembling as he held my radio. I see the boy in my shop smiling at the magic of a signal found. I see Mary laughing at my strange metaphor, the house full of quiet music that never quite came through clearly. All of it, every sound, every silence, is still alive somewhere in the static. I don't know what made me take the old radio out. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was age, that soft, slow fading when you start to feel the world slipping just beyond reach. I was in my late 70s, my hands shaking too much to hold a soldering iron steady, but the weight of that radio still felt familiar, almost comforting. I wiped the dust from its casing, traced the faded scratches on the side, the same marks from France, from Germany, from another lifetime. It had survived better than I had. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Mary used to read her letters, and plugged it in. For a long while, nothing happened, just silence. Then, slowly, that low hum filled the air again. I can't explain what it felt like. It wasn't just sound, it was memory waking up. The static came first, as always, then faint voices, too distant to make out, weaving in and out of the noise. I turned the dial carefully, each click like turning back time. I heard fragments, music, laughter, maybe even a news report, but it all blurred together. And then, for the briefest second, I thought I heard something else, a voice I knew. Maybe it was a trick of the signal, or maybe just the mind of an old man who spent too long talking to ghosts. But I swear, in that thin line between noise and silence, I heard Mitchell's voice again, the same tone, the same calm he had before Normandy. "You copy?" he said, soft as breath. My hands froze on the dial. I wanted to answer, but no words came. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was back there. The mud, the rain, the fear, the pulse of life and death, all tangled together. Then it was gone, just static again, but it didn't scare me. It felt like a greeting. I realized then that I'd spent my whole life listening for that sound, the connection, the proof that somewhere out there, we're still being heard. Maybe that's what keeps us alive long after the war ends, the belief that our voices don't vanish. They just keep traveling, bouncing off clouds and stars, waiting to be picked up by someone who needs them. Maybe the engineer understood that too. Maybe that's what he saw when he opened my radio and said they couldn't build like. He wasn't talking about metal or design. He was talking about the invisible, the soul built into something by the hands of those who needed it to matter. I kept that radio on for hours that night. I didn't chase the stations anymore. I just listened. The static rose and fell like the tide, and in it, I heard everything. Mary's laughter, the boys' voices from the trenches, the echo of the Japanese engineer's soft confession. It wasn't noise anymore. It was all of us, stitched together across time, bound by the same fragile thread of human sound. And I understood something I never had before. Connection doesn't end. It changes form. It fades, distorts, returns in echo. But it's always there, waiting for someone to tune in. The next morning, I wrote a letter to my son. I told him where the radio was, what it meant, and why I had never thrown it away. I told him that one day, when he's ready, he should turn it on, not to hear music or news, but to listen to the spaces between the sounds. That's where life hides. That's where memory breathes. He'll find me there too, somewhere in the static, still listening. Now the nights are long, and the air grows cold more quickly than it used to. I don't sleep much. I sit by the window, the radio humming softly beside me, and I think about the engineer, about the men who never came home, about the voices that still drift through the ether long after the world stopped calling their names. And I smile, because maybe, just maybe, they're still out there, finding their way through the noise, whispering to someone like me, someone who still remembers how to listen. So if you've come this far, if my story reached you through all the static of your own life, do one thing for me. Like this, share it, and subscribe. Not for me, for the voices that still echo out there, waiting for someone to hear them again.